In this lesson, you'll learn about how new inventions and new technologies made a big difference. Let's take a look at your lesson question. How did technology change Americans' lives during the industrial age? Well, you'll learn about how Americans found better communication, better transportation, and better advances to help their lifestyles. But in the first part of this lesson, you'll learn about how Americans found new ways to communicate, to share thoughts, ideas, and information. I want you to imagine how long it would take to send a message across America if you didn't have communication devices like telephone, internet, or a very fast mail service. Well, in the early 1800s, communication from coast to coast took a very long time. In fact, in the 1840s, if you were to send a package or a letter by a mail carriage from New York to San Francisco, it would take up to 180 days, or about 6 months. Well, things started to improve as Americans found faster transportation. In 1869, after the Transcontinental Railroad was built, a package could be delivered in just 7 days. But still, imagine having to wait for more than 2 weeks just to send someone a message and to get an answer. Well, in the middle of the 1800s, the invention of the telegraph changed communications forever. It provided almost instant communication for everybody. The telegraph became the first device to allow instant messages to be sent through wires using a signal code. The telegraph was invented by Samuel Morse, and it was first used in 1844. Now, many Americans started to use this device so that they didn't have to wait for days or weeks to communicate messages. The telegraph was very useful to the military. Now, both sides in the Civil War, but especially the Union side, used the telegraph as part of their war machine. In fact, the U.S. military continued to use the telegraph as late as the Vietnam War. Business owners could place and accept orders by telegraph. Journalists and reporters used the telegraph to send news across the country. The telegraph gave people nearly instant communication with their family and their friends, both near and far. And beginning in 1871, people could even transfer money using the telegraph. Now, the end result was the communication changed forever. Now, in order to communicate through a telegraph, you needed to know Morse code. Morse code was made up of a series of long and short clicks and beeps, and only experienced operators could understand it. You had to know what to listen for. And even so, the code is still used today.
Even when the telegraph was first created, people were already thinking of ways to improve it. One inventor who did this was Granville Woods, an African-American engineer and inventor who worked to improve America's railroads. Woods created the multiplex telegraph. This was a device that allowed telegraphs to be used on moving trains. Wood's invention helped trains communicate. This meant that they could avoid collisions and run on schedule. But the invention of the multiplex telegraph was just a start. What if the entire telegraph could be replaced?
The telegraph was only the first communication revolution in the late 1800s. Like you noticed, it was lacking something, and inventors continued to work. In the late 1800s, an inventor named Alexander Graham Bell patented a device we now call the telephone. The telephone improved on the telegraph by allowing people to instantly communicate through speech, and it did this by carrying sound over wires. The telephone was invented by Alexander Graham Bell in 1876. It was originally intended to be an electrical speech machine to help deaf people, but when trying to build this, Bell discovered a way to transmit sounds electromagnetically. Bell's telephone looks very different from the phones we use today, but we still use his basic design. Telephones had the same huge impact that the telegraph did, except that telephones transmitted human voices, not a code made up of dashes and dots. This made communication even simpler and quicker. In 1877, a year after Bell patented his phone, the first telephone line was built. It stretched between Boston and Somerville, Massachusetts. In the same year that the telephone line was built, the first telephone company was established. It was called the Bell Telephone Company. Eventually, American Telephone and Telegraph, or AT&T, took over the Bell Company, and telephones became widespread. In 1914, the first transcontinental telephone line was built. Now Americans could speak with each other instantly from coast to coast. The telephone was the second big revolution in communications, and it's continuing to evolve today. Compared to the first telephones, today's phones are smaller, more portable, digital, and they are able to serve for other purposes like texting or email. Today, the telephone is the most widely used communication device in the entire world. Okay, now we've learned all about the big changes that were happening in the late 1800s in the field of communication. Let's move on and start talking about transportation.
Remember how it could take days or weeks to send a message from one coast to the other in the early 1800s? Well, transportation moved just as slowly. Whether you were trying to move within the cities or traveling across America, transportation wasn't easy during this time. In cities, people moved from place to place on foot, by horse, or by carriage. Your options were always limited. No matter what, if you wanted to go somewhere, your trip was going to be slow, you'd be limited in where you could go, and it would be challenging to get there. Think about if you had to walk everywhere you wanted to go. I bet you wouldn't go very far. This really limited people's opportunities in the cities because commuting was a very slow process before transportation innovations. Commuting means traveling from one place to another on a regular basis, like going to work or to school. We already talked about the invention and expansion of the railroads in the mid-1800s. When this expansion happened, people were able to move to cities more easily. This forced city planners to find a way to help people commute. Here are some ways they adapted technology to this need. In the 1830s, people used horse-drawn trolley cars that were on rails to commute. But with the invention of electricity, cities began to use electric trolleys in the 1870s. The problem was that trains running along the streets made things too crowded. So, elevated trains were created that rose above city traffic, as well as underground rail systems called subways. Chicago's elevated train system, the L, and Boston's subway system, the T, began operating in the 1890s. It was the first subway in the United States, and it actually still operates today. These innovations changed commuting forever for city residents.
Rails were helpful and they made it easier for people to commute, but there's one problem with a railroad. It starts at point A and it ends at point B, and you're not really free to go wherever you want. So as early as the 1700s, people were trying to build vehicles that moved by their own power. Some had steam engines, and some had burned coal gas or benzene, which is a petroleum product like gasoline. This changed in the late 1800s. Why did they want to do this? Well, because this kind of vehicle, an automobile, would bring some much needed advantages. Automobiles would allow Americans to have personal transportation. There would be no more sharing a crowded streetcar. They'd have freedom. They could go where they wanted, not just where the rails could take them. They'd have convenience to go where they wanted, not just when the trains decided that they would be running. The first gasoline powered American automobile was made in 1893 by the Duryea brothers of Springfield, Massachusetts. At first, autos were expensive, but one inventor and businessman, Henry Ford, helped to change that. Ford was the owner of the Ford Motor Company. Now, after seeing how expensive early autos were, he became determined to make a cheaper car that everyone could afford. Henry Ford made cheaper cars by using interchangeable parts, mass production, and carefully created fast moving assembly lines. Assembly lines and mass production techniques already existed when Henry Ford started making automobiles. He didn't invent any of those things, but what he did was he revolutionized the assembly line by making the assembly line itself move on a conveyor belt. Workers didn't have to move anymore. The work came to them on that moving conveyor belt. They would perform their task, and then the car would move on to the next worker. That new assembly line made these cars cheaper. When the cost of making the car dropped, the cost for consumers dropped as well. And as a result, the popularity of the automobile exploded. With good advertising and cheaper vehicles, Ford sold millions of automobiles to Americans. The automobile became something for everyone. All right, so here's some examples of how transportation inventions affected people's lives. Freedom of movement. Improved automobiles, especially cars like the early Model T, gave almost everybody the chance to spend a day in the country. They could take a vacation away from home, or they could just go out for a ride on a Sunday afternoon. Improved trains and automobiles let people travel more quickly and comfortably for pleasure or for business. Public transportation systems, we talked about those, such as Boston's T and Chicago's L trains, allowed people to live in cities and to move around within them much more easily. Better trains and trucks meant that farmers could move their products to market more quickly, and this gave people in the cities access to much fresher foods.
Changes in transportation also helped African Americans move during the Great Migration. This period lasted from around 1916 to 1970. People traveled by car and train to new places. They moved out of the South into cities in the North and Midwest. In 1910, almost 6,000 African Americans were living in Detroit. By 1930, that number increased to 120,000. They left to escape the harsh, unfair treatment they faced in the South. They also moved to find new opportunities. Many Black Americans took jobs working in factories, including for automobile companies. For many African Americans, factory work could be dirty and dangerous, such as running blast furnaces. However, some found jobs as skilled workers operating machines or as factory forepeople.
thing about innovation is that it never stops. Changes in transportation throughout the 20th and into the 21st century have brought cars of every shape, size, and color. They've brought high-speed railroad trains and giant airliners. Here's your lesson question. How did technology change Americans' lives during the industrial age? Now you know that the second industrial age changed the way that people communicated and the way that they got from place to place. But it goes further than that. It changed their day-to-day lives. In this segment, you're going to learn about more inventions that changed Americans' lives at home. Chances are, when people think of famous American inventors, Thomas Edison is one of the first to come to mind. Edison was a self-taught inventor who built his own research facilities in New Jersey. Edison was a prolific inventor. He and his research team invented hundreds of new products and designs. In the end, Edison got more than 1,000 patents, including a practical incandescent light bulb, which provided a dependable source of electric light, systems for distributing electric power so that electricity could be used everywhere, the phonograph, which played music, and a motion picture machine, which became an important part of entertainment. Now let's take a look at a few of those inventions. If you think about it, your life today is surrounded by inventions pioneered by Edison and his fellow researchers, from the lights in the room that you're sitting in to the machines that you use to listen to music and to watch movies. Edison's version of the incandescent light bulb and the electricity that lights it opened the night for travel, business, entertainment, and ordinary activities. Imagine what the world would be like without it. Edison was fascinated with the telephone, so he explored ways to record and then to transmit sound. The result was the phonograph, a device that could record and play music. Edison was also interested in recording images, and this led him to develop a motion picture camera and a motion picture player, movies. Edison wasn't the only influential inventor who changed people's day-to-day lives. So like Edison, Madam C.J. Walker was a self-taught success too. Walker was one of the first female African American entrepreneurs. Remember that entrepreneurs are people who start their own businesses. In her late 20s and into her early 30s, Walker struggled with hair loss, and this led her to begin experimenting with hair care treatment. She started a business that specialized in creating cosmetics specifically for African American women. Eventually, Walker built a $1 million business empire selling household products that were used by many Americans. One person with a good idea and persistence ended up affecting the lives of millions of people. Inventors like Edison and Walker changed people's lives, and they also inspired other inventors to keep on creating new and more inventive products. Think about it. We got leisure products like Kodak camera that allowed people to take pictures. We got packaged foods like Fig Newtons, cream of wheat cereal, and Royal baking powder, which cut down the time it took to cook meals at home. We also got small household appliances like vacuum cleaners and irons, and the less time that we had to spend cleaning house, the more time we had for leisure activities. In the late 1890s and the early 1900s, people began to demand these new consumer products, and businesses were happy to oblige. Businesses began to reach out to consumers through advertising, and they were hoping that new customers would discover these innovative products. Businesses began to place more and more advertising in catalogs, magazines, newspapers, and billboards. The end result was that Americans became greater consumers, or people who were more willing to shop. They spent money on leisure products and they were buying things that weren't necessities.